Hello and welcome. I'm Park Howell. You know that feeling when you really connect with a customer and help them get what they want out of life through your offering? But are these truly deep engagements too few and far between because you actually don't know your ideal buyer persona as well as you could? Our guest today is going to take the guesswork out of crafting buyer personas by showing you exactly how to use storytelling to truly understand what motivates your prospects from their point of view. Right now on The Business of Story. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so glad you're here. You know, whenever I'm considering the art of creating buyer personas, I can't help but recall Steve Martin's hilarious, at least to me, plumber's joke, which really underscores the importance of knowing your audience. Do you remember it?
Hey, I don't like to gear my material to the audience, but I'd like to make an exception because I was told that there is a convention of plumbers in San Francisco this week, and I understand about 30 of them came down to the show tonight. So before I came out, I worked up a joke especially for the plumbers, and now those of you who aren't plumbers probably won't get this and won't think it's funny, but I think those of you who are plumbers will really enjoy this. And so if you're not a plumber, please just bear with me for a while and just kind of hold off on this, but I would like to do this for the plumbers. So here we go. This lawn supervisor was out on a sprinkler maintenance job, and he started working on a Finlay sprinkler head with a Langstrom 7-inch gangly wrench. Well, just then a little apprentice leaned over and said, you can't work on a Finlay sprinkler head with a Langstrom 7-inch wrench. Well, this infuriated the supervisor, so he went and got volume 14 of the Kinsley manual. And he reads to him and says, the Langstrom 7-inch wrench can be used with the Finlay sprocket. Just then, the little apprentice leaned over and says, it says sprocket, not socket. Were those plumbers supposed to be here this show, or was that...
When I first heard that joke, I thought it was one of the weirdest and funniest bits ever. But there's nothing weird or funny about trying to figure out what will move your audience to action. So how do you develop an authentic buyer persona that helps you understand what they want, empathize with why they want it, and appreciate what they believe and value so you can motivate them to action, again, from their point of view? Jim Kraus is here to show you how.
I can't emphasize enough how very simple probes can get you a lot of information. So I've trained a lot of moderators over my career, and one of the things I always tell them is, because a lot of times people get very anxious when they start doing interviews for the first time. They always get caught up in what's the perfect question? They start thinking about the next question, and they're not even listening. A lot of times it's as simple as, can you tell me a little bit more about that? What do you mean by that? It could even be a or a really, inquisitive really. And that's all you need. You don't need anything much more than that. Sometimes you need more specific questions. You have to listen attentively, of course. But the biggest tip I can give you to make sure that you haven't missed that good question is just ask a question that's curious, that you're, hey, I heard what you said. That's interesting. Is there anything more you can tell me about that? That's 90% of it.
Jim Kraus is president of the Buyer Persona Institute, or BPI. He has 3 decades of experience managing high-performing market research teams on the supplier and client side, including companies like IBM, Prudential, and Guardian Life. In that time, he's worked on hundreds of studies that directly inform marketing, sales, and product strategy, with a particular focus on understanding buyer attitudes and behaviors in markets involving more complex purchase decisions. So on today's show, you're going to learn 3 really important things. Number 1, why stories communicate critical information in a far more authentic, digestible, and insightful way than a repetitive Q&A approach ever could. You'll learn how to conduct story-based interviews with buyers to understand how they really think and feel and what motivates them to take certain actions. And finally, how organizations can use insights from buyers to tell stories about their own brand and solutions that creates real connection and trust with prospective customers. So please welcome to The Business of Story, Jim Kraus. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Park. Appreciate you having me.
So you are the president of Buyer Persona Institute. Tell us a little bit about the Institute and what it is you all do there.
The main thing that we try to do is really from a marketing, sales, and product perspective, we work with organizations to really try to understand their prospective buyers in the words of buyers. So we are really, in a way, we are really in the story business because we're trying to understand their buyers' stories so that we can provide them insights that help particularly their marketing efforts, but also their sales and even their product roadmap. So that's the main core business that we're in.
Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer that you've got to know your buyers, your prospects, your customers. Why does it seem it's so difficult to do that? Or a lot of companies seem to just kind of guess at it or make some assumptions about their buyer personas and not really do the deep dive that's required to truly understand your audience in a godlike way.
Yeah, so let me first just talk about the challenge of marketers, right? I mean, one of the major disadvantages that marketers have in their job is, fundamentally they're trying to, with a group of potential buyers or a market, if you will, they're trying to increase awareness and consideration and preference for both their brand as well as their solutions. Now, sales professionals have the luxury of being able to talk to prospective customers and current customers in a one-on-one setting on a regular basis. So they instinctually start to really understand what their customers and buyers really think. What are their needs? What are their concerns? What does their decision process look like for their different solutions? What are the outcomes they're trying to achieve? And how do they talk about it? What's the customer's story? And what words do they use to describe some of these things? The job of the marketer is a bit challenging because they're operating in a one-to-many environment, whereas the sales professional generally has to convince one at a time. The marketer is really trying to influence an entire market. And the disadvantage they have is they don't get to have those one-on-one conversations with prospective buyers as much. So what ends up happening is they're trying to develop marketing strategies, marketing content with information that could either be, anecdotal from some things they hear from sales professionals. It may be based on secondary research. It may be based on conventional wisdom of the organization, but it's not based on actual facts. So a lot of times they end up making things up or taking their best guess because they just don't have that information. So what we do is we try to take all the guesswork out. Why guess at it, right? You're spending a lot of money and time and effort developing marketing programs. There really is no reason not to go talk to prospective buyers and hear their story and really understand what is their decision process all the way from the initial point where they say, hey, you know what? Today is the day that we need to do something to remedy a particular challenge we have or a particular opportunity we have and we need a particular solution, all the way from that point forward, all the way until the time where they actually make a decision. So one of the challenges I think we have at the Buyer Persona Institute is there's a lot of information out right now. People write about buyer personas in different ways, and people put different definitions on them. And we have a really specific definition we put on buyer personas. So a lot of what's called buyer personas in the market, we think of here as more buyer profiles. Those may be things like, what role or function does somebody have in the organization? What are their overall priorities? Maybe what information sources they use and read, things of that nature. And that's all great. But what's missing oftentimes is the stuff that really helps you develop very focused and thoughtful marketing programs that impact performance. So what we do is we don't focus on roles or people, we focus on the buying decision. So what we do is we go out and actually interview buyers that have in the past 12 months, sometimes even sooner than that, actually went through a complete evaluation for our client's particular solution. And we interview them and develop profiles based on those actual decisions. So for a buyer persona, for us, it's not a specific role or even individual. It's here is the buying committee. These are the things that they're doing within the buying decision. That's a difference maker because it gives the information. It's almost like the North Star, if you will. It guides really just about any marketing and sales activity you're going to participate in, whether it's thought leadership or lead gen or sales plays. It can inform all those things.
And Jim, how did you get into this business? I mean, it's a very niched research type business where you work so hard to truly understand what motivates that individual sitting across from you. Do you come from a communications research background, or how do you find yourself here?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. And in a lot of ways, Buyer Persona Institute is the perfect match for me. I've been doing market research or the market insights business for 3 decades now. Both on the client side, where I was doing research for organizations, both large technology and financial services organizations, as well as on the supplier side. So on market research firms, conducting research on behalf of organizations. And one of my pet peeves has always been not wanting to do research that ends up not being used, right? There's a lot of market research, quote unquote, that goes on in the industry. I could argue a lot of it doesn't have the impact on business performance that it should. The thing I love about Buyer Persona Institute and how we kind of founded each other is it's so pragmatic. It's a no-brainer. Like anybody that we talk to that really understands the methodology that we use and what we actually deliver back to our clients, they make great use of it. You almost can't help but make great use of it because there's a lot of thought that goes into initiating one of these types of studies. And literally, when you can walk in the shoes of your buyer, it provides all types of very pragmatic insights as far as how do you really differentiate yourself versus the competition and how you design strategies and tactics to really win the hearts and minds of your prospective buyers. So for me, it was just a very pragmatic leap from doing market research and doing a variety of different types of custom studies to something that I can really focus on and know that it just has an incredible impact with our clients, which is, a great feeling.
Yeah, that market research, I would imagine, is larger in scope. So you're looking at overall markets, buyer behavior and whatever, but now you are down to that single individual and really understanding what makes them motivated to do something. And then I suppose you ascribe their actions to larger markets. So if they're doing it this way, then presumably others of your ideal prospects or customers are thinking the same way.
Exactly. And it brings up a great point because one of the nuances between what I've done for so many years and this one is they're very closely tied. It's the same discipline, if you will. But the approach that we take to our interviews is for our clients, we go out and find prospective buyers. So we don't use our clients' customer list. We don't want to interview your customers, quite candidly. Your customers have a certain bias, a certain view of you, good, bad, or otherwise. We don't want to talk to your sales professionals. You're already getting feedback from them. We want to talk to folks that you would ideally want in your pipeline. So these are folks that may have selected another competitor, for example. So the approach that we take with these interviews is a little bit different than a typical quote unquote market research interview. It's not a, structured discussion guide where we're asking, a set number of questions. We spend 45 minutes speaking to buyers. The only structured question we ask them is at the very start. And we ask them, take me back to the day when you first decided you had a need for X. And X would be the particular buying decision that they're making. From there, we really give the interviewees, the buyers, a lot of room to tell us their story. And we listen very carefully to what they're saying. And we ask a lot of probing questions because what we find is really the good stuff is never in the first answer. It's in the second and third answer. So as an example of that, you could ask a buyer about, we're talking to them about why they made a particular decision. They may tell us a little bit about their decision criteria and they may say, well, cost was a big factor. Well, that's great. You can take that at face value. But if you say just something simple as, tell me a little bit more about cost. How did cost come into play? Now they're likely to tell you some other things. They're likely to tell you, well, XYZ provider provided a certain discounts, or they had a pricing model, a subscription model that they offered that we really liked, or they offered some types of guarantees. Oh, tell me a little bit more about that. Then they'll get you even into more detail. And that's where all the good stuff is, right? That's the stuff where when you really allow them to tell their story, which is what we're allowing them to do, and asking really good questions to completely understand it. Now you're really inside their brain. You're inside all their actions. You know why things went the way they did. And that's something you can really, really do some good things with when you have that kind of knowledge.
I think it's interesting. You start with that first question, essentially is saying, take me to a moment in time, or you said, take me to that day when. And really all storytelling is about a moment in time when everything changed. So for instance, we are not very successful in sales and marketing if our prospects are stuck in status quo. And there has not been an inciting incident, to use a story term, or a trigger moment that is going to shake them out of what they've been doing to embrace change and then to go and do the heavy lifting to figure out, okay, what is it that we've got to do? Because whenever you're doing change, you fall into that jealous and J curve of things always get tougher before they get easier. So our jobs as marketers are to shake people out of status quo and get them into doing something that can be more powerful for them. In understanding that insight of that customer with that very first question, where does it take you then? I mean, is it hard to get people to arrive at that singular moment, or can you get them there very quickly where they say, oh, Jim, yeah, I can tell you exactly when that happened. It was such and such a time, and here's what went down.
It's usually pretty easy because the thing that you have to remember, and this is why this is the key insight, is that there's a very likely chance that this particular buyer or prospect, however you want to think about them, has had this challenge, or maybe it's an opportunity they've been kind of sitting on for a long period of time. So what our job is, we try to understand, like, why is it now? Why is now the moment? What has changed now, right? And that's something that is usually very top of mind, right? It could be something where they said, look, we want to do something about this last year for XYZ reasons, which we'll understand. But this is why at this moment in time, it's important. And the reason that's so, we have different types of information that we deliver back to clients in our buyer persona. We call them the 5 rings of insight. The first one is what we call priority initiatives, which is what we're talking now. You can think about those as triggers, if you will. The second one, which I'll mention because they kind of go hand in hand, is success factors. And this is simply, what are the end outcomes that these buyers actually want to achieve? So if you know their priority initiatives, their triggers, and you know what outcomes they want to achieve, there's all kinds of things you can do from that from a marketing perspective. Number one is you can find out, where do you need to meet these folks? Like where are they, right, in the stratosphere, if you will, where you can find people that have this type of need or this type of challenge, if you will. The other reason it's really important is because, as you mentioned, Park, and you're dead on this, is that change is hard. So one of the things you can do as a marketer is, how do you create a view of success for them? How do you paint a picture of hey, look, you've got this challenge now, but let me help you. Let me get you smarter about it. Let me hopefully give you a new way to think about it. And let me show you a path that you can take that can lead to a really great outcome for you. Because it all starts there. If they don't have that belief, if they can't start thinking about their challenge in a new way, you're going to be very undifferentiated in the market. You're going to be like everybody else. You're going to end up talking about your product features, and you're never going to be that role of trusted advisor, which is really what you want, because that can lead to a lot of good places for both you and your client.
When you say think about a problem in a new way, what do you mean by that?
So a lot of times you have a particular challenge and you think about it and you can get stuck on it, or you can be limited in, you feel like there's only 1 or 2 ways to solve it. Maybe those 1 or 2 ways isn't the ideal way, or you think of a bunch of different inhibiting factors around it. I'll mention the third ring of insight now because that's kind of a good segue into that. We call it perceived barriers. And perceived barriers are all those things that we find out from buyers as far as why wouldn't they make this investment in you, or why wouldn't they make this investment at all? So one of the things that we're trying to really understand is, by understanding those different dimensions of the buying decision, we're able to look at it and say, hey, it doesn't need to be that way. Maybe you just need to look at it differently. And it doesn't always need to be like it's our solution that does it, although that probably or hopefully contributes to it some way, or you weave in that story, but it's just a way to show some type of progression potentially, right? Or your view of going A to B doesn't have to be that way. Maybe there's a different path you can take. Maybe there's a new way of thinking of it where it could be less painful. Maybe there's another way of thinking about it where it's not just this thing you're solving for. Hey, you're actually going to do this, and there's some other benefits you're going to get that, oh, by the way, maybe things that you really would love to achieve as well. So it's just kind of putting a twist on things and putting an optimistic but realistic bent on a problem or a challenge that a customer may have had for quite a while.
So you've got that ring number one and the trigger moments. So that is your first question you ask them is when did you know that this was a problem and what did that look like? And then ring number two is the outcome. And that is, what is the outcome you're looking for?
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, so you're in our world where you're creating a statement of agreement for them. Here's what we want, and here's why it's important for us. This is what it looks like to us down the road. But then you get to that circle or ring number three, those perceived barriers, but you don't have it because of this, this, and this from their perception. But in your probing questioning, I suppose you're also kind of highlighting other barriers that may be something that they hadn't even considered.
We try not to do that if possible, and the reason for that, and here's the reason why. It's a reasonable assumption. We ask a lot of probing questions, but nothing that's too aided, right? We're never going to put a list in front of a buyer and say, "Is this a barrier? Is this a barrier?" And the reason we don't do that is because inevitably, when we have these discussions with buyers and we allow them room to really tell us their story, 99% of the time, all the really important defining moments come out. So I could put a list, and we do a lot of quantitative research. I've done thousands of surveys in my career. I could put a list in front of somebody and tell me, like, check all the ones that were a barrier to you, and they'll tell me, right? But it's not nearly as impactful as finding out that when you're talking to somebody, they're really focused on one or two things. They'll say the other things as well, but it's really these one or two things and how they're thinking about them as perceived barriers. Those are the ones that we want to make really sure come out of this. And some of the other ones may be secondary. One other point too, Park, is you mentioned the different rings, and I could talk about the other two as well if helpful, but we don't ask them sequentially. So we don't have like I said, this is a pretty unstructured interview with certain guardrails, right? And our interviewers, we have expert interviews that have been doing this for years now, and they know how we go about and do this. But we don't ask things sequentially, the rings. They just kind of come out. And what we'll do is if we don't get to one of them, so for some reason, if we haven't gotten to any perceived barriers, which is usually not the case, we'll loop back with them, right? And we'll talk to them a little bit about that, again, without giving them a list, but just getting into like, tell me a little bit about what are some of the things that maybe were getting you stuck. What did you do about them? What concerns did folks have about making this investment at all or in certain providers? And that's about as aided or probing as we'll get, very specifically.
Because you don't want to lead the witness.
Correct.
I take it.
Correct.
Yeah. You don't want to take them down some presumed rabbit hole that they hadn't even thought about, but they might be following along with your questions.
Yep.
So you've got those first three rings. Yeah. Let's talk about the other two.
Yeah. So the fourth one is decision criteria, right? So this is kind of the no-brainer one. When I would say, if I had two favorites, it's perceived barriers and decision criteria. Perceived barriers I really like from a impact perspective because these are things that you want to address as a marketer proactively. You don't want to, try to sweep them under the rug or hope that your prospect or your buyer isn't going to bring them up. These are the realities, whether they state them or not. These are the things that you need to know that they're going to have concerns about. So it'll let you address them proactively and thoughtfully. Decision criteria, the fourth one you just asked me about, the way we think about them here is these are the key questions that you need to have answers for, right? And not fake answers. These are the questions that they're going to be evaluating all the different alternatives that they have to solve this particular challenge, including solving it internally. So if you know what questions that they're going to be basing their decision on, the ones you have answers, think about how much smarter you can be as far as the answers. The other huge advantage is one of the frustrations that we have about the marketing profession is we see marketers spend so much time putting out so much different content, right? It's all different types of content, thought leadership, sales collateral, all different things, all different kinds of messaging around features and benefits. And none of it's bad. I mean, it's all good stuff. But when you know the decision criteria, it lets you be smarter, not work harder, but work smarter, because now you can get really focused on the things that really matters to buyers. That's where you want to put all your energy and resource behind. So it ends up actually reducing the amount of work that you do, but making the work that you do much more impactful. And then the fifth one, the last one, is buyer's journey. And that's the one where we really just try to, in very detailed way, basically show what are the steps that a buyer takes during the entire purchase decision, all the way from initially identify the need all the way to making that final purchase decision. who was involved in the decision, what roles, what information sources were used, what things happened, were there proof of concepts, were there presentations, external sources, peer networks, what are the things that are really influencing this? The way we do this, I think, is pretty impactful, because we don't just ask questions like, what are the information sources that you used, right? And who was influencing the decision? What we will do is, because we give the buyer time to tell us their story, we will literally understand how did they go from identifying their initial set of competitors or partners that they might consider, all the way down to how they wean them out. So if they go from, as an example, let's say they're looking at 5 different potential providers, and then they went to 3. Great. Tell us how you went to 3. How did that happen? The 2 that you didn't select, what happened there? Then maybe they went down to a final 2. Tell us about that. So we not only deliver the steps, we can also deliver what are some of the key levers as the buyer continuously weeds down their options. So that just adds so much texture to the buyer's journey, and it makes it so much more actionable when you're delivering those insights back to marketing and sales professionals.
What are some of the biggest mistakes people make when they try to do this themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the devil's in the details, really, for this, right? So one of the biggest challenges that folks have doing it themselves is just finding the right people to talk to. We use a number of global recruiting partners to do this that we have vetted, that we know can do the job in finding these sorts of individuals for us, regardless of what the particular buying decision or solution is. We also use different ones for different needs. So if we're working with a client who's got a technology solution, for example, we've got recruiting partners we know that are pretty good at finding buyers of those type of solutions. If it was something, somebody's in the group benefits, employee benefits industry, we might tap a couple of other recruiters. So we have a good partner network to be able to do this, because there is no one that's going to do it for everybody. There's just not. I've been doing this for a long time. Like, everybody's got their strengths and weaknesses and their sweet spot. So we work with the ones that we need to work with. The other thing that's difficult is, once you find a recruiting partner, we develop a short questionnaire. We call it a screener in the market research biz, to basically ask potential interviewees questions that will either qualify them or not qualify them for the interview. And it's not an easy process. And we say no to way more people than we say yes to, because one of the things we do up front with all our clients is we have an hour-long meeting where we define very specifically what is the buying decision that we're trying to create a buyer persona for. Now, that sounds really simple. Sometimes it is. It's usually not, because you're really trying to reverse engineer your sales pipeline and say, what are the types of people or organizations I'd want to have as potential prospects? We need to define what that is very specifically, and then set other parameters around it, and then go find those people. And we do that just by making calls online, different ways we have of getting in touch with people, and then qualifying them for the research. The third thing that is difficult is, if you don't know how to do it, is doing the interviews themselves. So this is a different type of interview. We don't have a structured discussion guide. It's more that we have people that are trained in marketing and market research, that have really taken time to learn our methodology and how to conduct interviews where you're asking a lot of probing questions, but you really have the patience to be a journalist and really truly let buyers tell their story, because that's where all the magic happens. And it's hard. It seems easy, but it's hard not to jump the gun and start aiding people, or throwing them different lists. You really have to take the time to really allow them to tell their story and ask good questions that gives them the freedom to do that in a way that's going to give you insights. So that's probably the hardest part. And then the last part, which folks find a little bit challenging, is you get all this great information back, and then you need to do something with it. So what we do is, again, we've been doing this for years, is we take all these, we get thousands of verbatim quotes from buyers, which we deliver back to our clients, because that stuff is gold, right? Because it's literally how the buyers are thinking and what language they're using. So if you're creating content, for example, as a marketing professional, you're getting to see how they talk and think about it, right? That provides such great backdrop to your content. But from an analysis perspective, it can be problematic, because you have all this unstructured data, right? This isn't numerical data, and you need to be able to look for patterns across all the interviews you're doing to find out, what are the key insights that we're finding. So in a typical buyer persona study, We may come up with anywhere from 35 to 45, 50 different quote unquote attributes that we find across those 5 rings I mentioned. And all those are found by us looking at all the verbatims, looking at the interviews holistically, individually, as well as across them, and culling out what are the key insights from those. That can be another challenging thing for folks trying to do it themselves if it's not something they've done a lot in the past.
How many people do you need to have in a focus group or in a survey that gives you the information that you can really believe in?
So for us, our rule is we like to do at least 10 interviews if we're doing a particular buying occasion. So if there is no segment, so as an example, if you have a particular solution and you're targeting larger enterprises, let's say it's a B2B solution, and maybe you're doing a couple of geos, by the time we get to the 10th interview, it's rare that we're learning anything new. Everything we're learning is kind of confirming what we already know. Mm-hmm. When we'll do more than 10 is when we get a situation where it's typically enterprise size. That's the variable for the most part, where we may have the same solution or buying decision, but somebody has a market where they're going after really small SMB firms and they also may be targeting large, much larger enterprise. That's where we can see some real differences in the personas. And then we'll usually insist they do at least 6 to 8 for each one of the segments. Now, I will tell you, as a research purist, I'm a researcher in training, I had some questions about that, right? Like, do you need to do more interviews? One of the things that we found is we do quantitative validation studies and segmentation studies afterwards. If clients want that, we are able to do that. We're happy to do that. We have found way more times than not that what we're getting back in the quantitative survey just confirms everything we found in the in-depth interviews. So it's not to say it's not valuable for a particular client. It gives them the confidence to say, like, okay, what we thought we had, we have. Well, now we can move forward with even more confidence. But I will say, we don't hard sell that. We make it more of if you'd like to do it, we're happy to do it. But we've done enough of these. I mean, we've done it for over 150 global companies over the past decade plus. And way more times than not, we've seen that those 10 interviews are more than enough to really wring out the insights that matter.
How many qualifying interviews do you typically have to do to find those 10 that are really giving you the goods?
I wouldn't say there's any set number. It really depends. Mm-hmm. Mostly it depends on the maturity of the solution. As an example, if we're working with a client who wants us to do buyer persona for a buying decision for a solution that's been out in the market for quite a while, a lot of companies have it in some regard. They use different providers, but it's a mature solution. It's been out there for a while. Those tend to be easier to find, right? For that reason, because there's more people that are doing them. The biggest challenge we have is when we get a solution that is not very mature in the market. So we do a lot of studies for technology companies where when we're doing our initial study design meeting with them and we talk to them, they're very honest. And there's we've got, Gartner doesn't even have a magic quadrant yet on this. There are some definitions out in the market, but a lot of folks are kind of making it up as they go. Technology changes so rapidly. I'm just using technology as kind of the obvious example. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do there is we spend a lot of time defining the buying decision because it may not be somebody that made that exact solution decision in the past 12 months. Oftentimes it will be somebody that made a decision about a particular solution and or other behaviors or attitudes that they had that shows a trajectory towards the ultimate buying decision that we're after, which is this less mature solution. So those type of things are a little bit more nuanced, a little more complicated, harder to find buyers. We have to do more screening to find those folks. Typically, when we do a 10 interview study, the interviewing phase will usually last anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. That's when we really just start recruiting until we finish the last one. It can go a little shorter, a little bit longer, depending on that dimension I just told you.
How do you get your interviewees to open up and to take the time and to really share their stories with you that give you the insights you're looking for?
It's easy. I mean, people like to share their stories, right? Because the nice thing about what we do as well is, unlike a lot of research where you're asking folks how they feel about a certain thing, here's a concept. Tell me what you think of this concept. What are your attitudes towards this topic? Those are fine. I mean, you'll get answers. They'll help you. They'll think about it. But when you ask somebody to talk about something that's already happened, and for the personas that we do, they're usually for higher consideration type solutions, right? It's not people buying a pack of gum at a store. These are solutions that have consequences, right? They're probably have multiple decision influencers. You probably have to live with this decision for a period of time. Switching costs are higher. It could have an impact on your career, even for certain, more higher costs or riskier type solutions. So because you're asking about something that they have a lot of vested interest in, and it's something they've already been through, they're telling you what happened, right? And think about a time where somebody asked you about something that happened in your life and showed genuine interest in it. You're happy to talk to them. So we usually schedule them for 35, 40 minutes. And, sometimes we can't get them off the phone, where, we get 45, even 60 minutes, and we're happy to spend that time with them if it helps us get the full story. But folks really enjoy it. I know we're paying them I'm not saying they would do it for free, but they do like to tell us their story. And it's certainly better than filling out a survey for them, more enjoyable, or trying to, pontificate about something. This is something that's very tangible and probably meant a heck of a lot to them during the time they were going through it.
As a host of a podcast, and I'm really quite unstructured here, as you know, you filled out some background information for me, and I've got a chance to go through the buyer persona book and so forth. But one of my biggest fears is always like, gosh, did I miss a good probing question? Was something obvious to my listeners that I missed as the show host? How could you coach us if we are out there just, maybe we are talking to some of our own customers or potential prospects, and we are just trying to get some insight. We haven't come to you guys yet to do this. We're just kind of doing it on our own. What are some of the kinds of probing questions that we could be thinking about, or where are the pitfalls? Where do people really miss the gold in an interview?
A couple of tips I can give you. We'll start with the bigger one and work down. I think from an overall perspective, how do you know you got the full story, or the story, all the details in the story you would need for a specific objective you had in mind, right? In this case, we're talking about a buyer persona. My golden rule is, do I feel like there's anything else this person could possibly tell me? That sounds kind of simple, but literally you get to a point where you really feel like there's nothing else you could possibly ask them, because they've told you just about every facet of everything that you would want to know. It's a gut feeling. It's something that, you kind of pick up as you go. So that's overall. As far as tips are concerned, I can't emphasize enough how very simple probes can get you a lot of information. So I've trained a lot of moderators over my career. And one of the things I always tell them is, because a lot of times people get very anxious when they start doing interviews for the first time. They always get caught up in what's the perfect question? They start thinking about the next question and they're not even listening. A lot of times it's as simple as, can you tell me a little bit more about that? What do you mean by that? It could even be a or a really, inquisitive really. And that's all you need. You don't need anything much more than that. Sometimes you need more specific questions. You have to listen attentively, of course. But the biggest tip I can give you to make sure that you haven't missed that good question is, just ask a question that's curious, that you're, hey, I heard what you said. That's interesting. Is there anything more you can tell me about that? That's 90% of it, right? Just having the patience. The time that moderators or the interviewers get in trouble is when they don't have the patience to do that, and they ask questions and they move on to the next question, the next topic. That's when they usually get yourself in trouble, because you'll find at the end of the interview, you didn't get to all the other things that you needed to get to. For us, for buyer persona, I had mentioned the 5 rings of insight. Those are key guardrails for us, right? So we have really specific reasons why we're getting that information, because it directly will inform things that will help our marketing, sales, and product clients. So that's the other guardrail for us. So we make sure that if for some reason, and it rarely happens, we've gone through a whole interview and nobody's told us, and the buyer hasn't told us at all about what are the outcomes they're looking for or success factors, we'll make sure we ask about those, right? So that's another guardrail for us.
Do people have an active listening talent or skill that some are really good at it and some aren't? Because I would imagine, and I find myself, again, even in my own show here, is I've got to be an active listener to be able to follow on with the next question. But then sometimes I get ahead of myself and I missed something that they said. That's really hard to do, is balance that active listening.
I think it's a talent, a skill, that inherent skill, and it's also something that can be developed. So I think it's both. Our best interviewers have a kind of a mix of things. Number one is they have insatiable curiosity, right? It's genuine. They're really interested in hearing the buyer's story. It's not a chore for them. They're not looking to ram through an interview. They're not looking to check the box, right? They're really going to the interview with an open mind saying like, okay, my job today is to understand this buyer's story. That sounds simple. And for some people, it is really simple because they have that genuine interest. Those are the ones that tend to be our better interviewers, the ones that we use, quite honestly. The other thing is, and I think I was alluding to this earlier, is taking time to let the buyer speak and to think a little bit and to let them bring their story to us in their cadence and their tone and their timing, if you will, and not getting too impatient with them. You never know who you're going to get on the end of the phone. You probably know this better than anybody, Park. Sometimes you'll get people that just talk, and they're not really addressing the topic that you asked them about, or they may be addressing it, but making the point over and over again. Once in a while, you get the perfect interviewee that tells you all the great stuff, and they do it in a very concise way. So you need to, as an interviewer, you need to know how to navigate all those three types of interviewees. And there's, different approaches you can take. The one that's that's telling you exactly what you need to know, not wasting any words, that's easy, right? The ones that are going off on different topics, you have to constantly bring them back, and not in a rude way at all. Just kind of gradually bring them back to the topic, and they'll tell you what you want to know, right? They're interested in helping you. And the ones that are going on about topics, what we tend to do is just to, I wouldn't say cut them off, but just move them along, right? And, move them along because we show them that, hey, look, there's a lot of great stuff that's in your head we're trying to get out of, and we're really trying to make sure that we cover our bases here. So they're all very effective strategies to work. It's just more just kind of practicing those strategies and just getting comfortable with them.
As I was preparing for this interview, I went to the Buyer Persona Institute and downloaded some of your templates. They're quite handy to use too. What kinds of resources do you have for people to go in, and if they're not ready to hire you guys quite yet, but could help guide them through their own persona interviews? What kind of resources do you have, and where could we send them?
Yeah, so on our website, we have we call it our masterclass, Buyer Persona Masterclass. And that is I think it's an 8-part class. It's all, you take it at your own pace. It's video based, but also has some PDF handouts in all the different modules as well. And it literally goes soup to nuts, all the way from how do you define what your buying decision is? How do you develop specifications for who you want to talk to? How do you go out and find those people? How do you conduct the interviews? What's the approach? How do you analyze the interviews? And tips on actually coming up with persona, reports, if you will, on the back end. So it really is soup to nuts. Based on some of the things I told you earlier, there can be challenges with them if it's not something that you do on a daily basis. But that is a great resource that we encourage you to go to there if you're really trying to become a pro around developing buyer personas. And then the other thing is we do have, as you had mentioned, Park, we do have templates on our website that you can use as far as interview questions, how you might want to structure the findings on the back end as well. And then, as you had mentioned, we wrote the book about, I think, 7 years ago now on buyer personas, and that's another great resource for anybody looking for more information.
It's a fantastic book. Of the buyer persona books that I've gotten, it's my number one, Buyer Personas: How to Gain Insight into Your Customers' Expectations, Align Your Marketing Strategies, and Win More Business. And I just like how common sense driven it is, and story driven, of course, it is, to really understand what motivates that person on the other end of the line. Well, thank you, Jim, for taking the time to be here today and talking a little bit about storytelling and developing buyer personas. Any other place you want to send people besides your website?
The website does a lot of great information. We put out a lot of blogs on our website. I encourage you to go there as well. I'm continuously posting on LinkedIn as well when we have new blogs or new information out as well. So I would encourage you to go there. And hopefully, we always try to attend different speaking events. So if you see us on the roster at a speaking engagement, would love to see you and introduce yourself and love to say hello.
Right on. Well, thanks, Jim, for taking the time to be here today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Park.
And thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, share it with your friends, family, colleagues, whoever who might be out there trying to get a better idea of who exactly that buyer persona is, that prospect is, and how they can make that decision to buy your product or service much easier. Share the show with them. If I can be of service to you, come on over to the Business of Story, where I've got all kinds of tools, tips, techniques to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And until next week, when we will have another amazing story artist right here for you like Jim, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.